Presentation screen.
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Ernest Lee, and as I was introduced, I was the executive director of the Korean Friendship Bell Preservation Committee, which is a nonprofit that's dedicated solely for the purpose of preserving the structure and the legacy of the Korean Bell of Friendship in San Pedro, California, which is the southern end of Los Angeles. Um, as of early part of this year, I have switched my job title as the story keeper of the Korean Friendship Bell, in part because we're undergoing a structural change to create a new organization to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Korean Friendship Bell being here. So can't believe how fast time is flying. So I will start with a little overview of what I'll be talking about today. And I actually sat in on your two earlier sessions this morning just so that I could try and avoid any topic that might overlap. But it seems like everything will be tied in together, so I'm quite pleased. So we will talk about the purpose and the historical background, and some of the things that we commemorate at the Bell, what historical events and what the connections are. And we will do a little deep dive into the embedded culture and symbolism of the structure and the Bell. And then there are some hidden significance and meaning because one of the side benefits of participating in this seminar is that you will have this insider information. And then you could talk about it as an expert and some future plans and question and answers to follow. Are you seeing the structure on your screen?
Yeah, we see the slides. Looks
Yeah, it's
good.
a beautiful, beautiful sunset here. The Korean Friendship Bell is a structure and the bell that was given to the people of the United States in 1976 for the American Bicentennial. The story goes that in 1974, there were some Korean Americans who were very prominent in the US entertainment industry and who also happened to be children of a very famous Korean thought leader and independence movement leader, Dosan An Chang-ho. You probably heard about President Park Chung-hee, who came into power through a coup in 1961, and he had gone through some transitional economic growth that had made some visible impact on Korean livelihood. And so he wanted to honor these figures that were overseas. And one of them was to create a memorial park in the name of Dosan An Chang-ho, one of the most famous Korean Americans and independence movement leaders. And his son, Philip An, who is a Hollywood actor, and are any of you old enough to remember the TV series called Kung Fu with David Carradine? Well, he's one of the teachers, the not blind one, but he's one of the first Asian Americans to have a star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But he was invited, nevertheless, to Korea with his children and his sister and their children to visit South Korea. And at that time, Mr. An apparently suggested to the Korean government that the American bicentennial was coming up and that perhaps it would be a nice gesture if the Korea gave something in return. And they thought it was such a great idea, they immediately formed a committee, and all the academics and craftsmen were called into this huge committee that they formed and looked long and hard into their history. So they said, well, we are going to go to 771 AD, almost 1,000 years before that time, to the divine bell of King Seongdeok. It's 18-ton bell or 17 and a half ton bell that is a monument to Korean achievement in culture and metallurgy. Because if you think about that, as being in the 8th century, they were able to cast a bell this large. So here's a close-up view of the bell. Even though the shape and the weight of the bell is exactly the same as the divine bell of King Seongdeok, this is adorned in an entirely different light and full of symbolism. So what you see is right after the restoration work, and you see to the left is the goddess Liberty, and to the right is a Korean Seonyo. And I think that um, there are many different interpretations or translations. I think some cultures call it Apsara, but in Korean mythology, Seonyo is actually like an angelic figure. They're actually messengers. They connect the heaven and earth, and they tend to travel. And sometimes they will actually have stories of them physically transforming themselves as uh, females and helping out humans. So the big difference between a Korean bell as opposed to a other style of Western bell is that the Korean bell is struck from a batter on the outside, and the bell itself is hung from a lattice structure, but there's a reflector bowl at the bottom that has certain acoustic features that I will get into a little bit more in detail later. So it is a bicentennial gift to the people of the United States. And we talked about the divine bell of King Seongdeok of the United Shilla period, 771 CE. That's actually something that I want to make sure, even though it's named after the divine bell as a King Seongdeok as the object of homage, it was actually his son and ultimately his grandson that finished the bell. So it is actually an act of ultimate filial piety. It's a son and the grandson trying to honor their parents. And Hyo is actually one of the central features of Korean cultural heritage. It was at that time in 1976 one of the largest bells in the world, 12 feet in height, 7.5 in diameter. We say 18 tons, but it's actually closer to 17 and a half. Made mostly of bronze alloy, and in 1976, it cost $500,000 to cast. So still quite a bit of money considering you could have bought a very nice Tudor home in Hancock Park at that time for about $50,000. So it required 9 surviving bellmasters because after the devastation of the 35 years of colonial rule and 3 years of Korean War, they had no infrastructure left and very few people were even forging anything like a bell. So these are the people that knew how to survive uh, during those long winters, and they were brought together to forge something this big for the first time in 1,000 years. So because they lacked the heavy equipment or machinery, they had to conscript the army as a laborer, and they would physically move material and hoist cranes using human labor as a power source. So 12,000 laborers were used to cast the spell. The pavilion that the bell is hanging from was constructed over 10 months by 30 artisans who flew over from Korea. And the stones were actually brought in raw form and they were hewn at the site. And they were actually the barracks in which they stayed during this labor of love is still there. And that was an additional cost, as we estimate, is about $450,000 at that time. So it was rung, the bell itself was rung on 4th of July in 1976 in Busan. The original plan was to have it be hung here and installed and ring for the new Independence Day. But as this was a first effort in almost 1,000 years, and because they were working through very cold winter in Korea, the bell that was initially finished in January for fine tuning developed a crack when they tried to strike it. So they had to start over with 12,000 people and 9 bellmasters going to work. And they were barely able to finish this and polish it in time for 4th of July to be loaded onto a commercial ship, US Montana. And the bell finally arrived in Port of Long Beach in September and finally installed in its current location in October 1st of 1976. And an official ceremony was held in 1976 to celebrate the bell's arrival. And here's a little inside information, but we say the bell was actually rung for the first time by then council president and the local city council member, John Gibson, who brought his son to congratulate the laborers for work well done, and he was allowed to ring the bell on the 2nd of October. One of the historical firsts was that immediately after the bell was dedicated, the Los Angeles declared it the historical cultural monument, and it was given the number 187 in 1978. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos. It's audio is in Korean, but I think you can actually get the gist of it.
We couldn't hear anything earlier. Did you check off the share audio button?
Well, I am trying to do that. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, good.
미국 창립 200주년 기념 선물로 보내기 위해 만들어진 우정의 종 타종식입니다. 미국에 보내기 앞서 종소리를 들어보기 위해 마련된 타종식에서 김성진 문화공보부 장관과 스나이더 주한 미국 대사가 종을 울렸습니다. 이 우정의 종은 오는 9월에 미국 로스앤젤레스의 종각에 봉안됩니다.
Were you able to hear it?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Okay, so that was actually an explanation. That was the 4th of July. They were ringing it before they loaded onto a boat. And that was Ambassador Schneider, US Ambassador to Korea, and the Korean Minister of Foreign Affairs, Honorable Kim Sung-jin, that they were on hand to ring this bell. And
미국의 로스앤젤레스입니다. 미국 독립 200주년을 경축하기 위해 정부가 제작해서 보낸 우정의 종이 우리 동포가 많이 사는 이곳 로스앤젤레스에 세워졌습니다. 우정의 종은 경주 박물관에 있는 공독사 신종과 규모가 같은 것으로 한미 우호와 세계 평화를 이루문해서 만들었으며 로스앤젤레스 시 당국은 우정의 종이 세워진 이 일대를 공원으로 꾸밀 계획이라고 밝혔습니다.
okay, so the second video, if you're able to see it, it's a little jittery. I think it might be the internet speed here, but was when the bell was struck for the first time through an official ceremony on the 3rd of October. And you can see that it was actually the mayor of Los Angeles and the head of the Korean Cultural Center here in Los Angeles ringing the bell together. And they brought like the full regalia of the traditional band, and they flew over from Korea to perform there in their traditional outfit. Did you notice something that was kind of striking in terms of difference as the earlier photograph and the video here? And if you guessed, is like, why is the structure so plain white? And we actually solved the mystery in dealing with this, that original design for the Korean bell was that it would be housed in a structure that would not be adorned by any decorations. In part because they wanted to accentuate the bell as the object that they were gifting, but B, because they thought it would be too difficult for Americans to try and maintain the ornate 단청 decorations. So by keeping it white, they could just throw on a coat of white paint whenever they needed it, and they could keep it going as long as they need it. But something changed, and then I will tell you about it a little bit later. So the purpose, obviously, is to commemorate the American bicentennial, and it is a symbol of Korean-American friendship and alliance, and it honors the veterans of the Korean War. And we heard earlier about how, there were 300,000 U.S. service members that were in Korea. But we actually have 36,592 Americans who lost their lives. And we actually have someone like Representative Henry Hyde who talked about how all these young men and women who volunteered for military service to go defend a country and save the people, they never knew. And, we're talking about someone in contemporary time period not knowing the difference between Japan and China and Korea, and telling somebody to go learn Japanese to speak to a Korean birth mother. It's kind of rings true in 1950. They could not even find a map with Korea still in it because, Japan had been occupying it for 35 years. And there's the provision about the honor of shared sacrifice and values that Korea and America share, which is freedom and which is democracy. And the Koreans actually looked to this as very important. They felt that America was a very wealthy country, and that Korea wanted to be wealthy as well. And they felt that one of the things that connected was a can-do pioneering spirit. And so from the perspective of 1970s Korea, looking at the US, was the city, a shining city on the hill, quite literally, with its wealthy people and freedom in full force. And Koreans, even as harsh as the conditions were, they aspired that those were the ideals. And of course, it's always the practice and details that makes the difference. So historical events and connections in 1882, the Korea became a diplomatic counterpart to the United States as a newly found Daehan Empire, because they had modernized and they tried to become a modern country. It was only a few years before the Japan would completely annex it through military means and series of treaties that ate away at Korean sovereignty. And the U.S. actually opened a diplomatic relationship, and Korea opened a delegation in Washington, D.C. And that site has been restored recently and is now a historical monument that you can go and visit. So the 1882 is a significant date, in part because that's tied to something that we see at the bell later. It talks about World War II. Ironically, it's the American victory in the Pacific, ultimately the surrender of Japan that liberated Korea. So World War II and liberation of Korea. And so during the World War II, Koreans always felt that they were fighting alongside the US, especially the Korean Americans living here in the US. And they somewhat enjoyed that distinction, that they were very distinct and different from Japan. And, there's like a whole chapter of history we can talk about how much injustice there were against the Japanese Americans living at the time. But for Koreans who were here, that distinction, that they were not Japanese, that they were independent people, and they had distinct culture and language, was something that they used often as a sign of their loyalty as opposed to any shadow of suspicion the Japanese Americans might have to endure. In one of the interesting stories about the Japanese Americans always point to something called Go For Broke, the Unit 444 that fought in Europe so bravely. I think five of its members won the Medal of Honor, and they proved their loyalty to America beyond any question. The irony is that it was actually a Korean American that was in charge of that unit. So Colonel Young-ok Kim, whom I'm sure somebody will be talking about at a later time, he was one of the most decorated soldiers in the World War II, directly involved with liberation of many towns in France and Italy. He led this all-Japanese unit in Europe. And so I think that was by design, that they actually wanted to make sure that somebody would keep them loyal. But also, we're actually trying to work with some historical folks to posthumously honor Colonel Kim, to award him the rank of a brigadier general if we can, but we'll see how that goes. We covered this morning about the Korean War, and we covered a little bit about the Vietnam War. They're all tied because in Korean War, US came to the aid of Koreans. In Vietnam War, Koreans joined the fight with the US against what they viewed at the time as a fight against communism, communist expansion. And that alliance that goes back to World War II continues to this day. In fact, the Koreans were serving as military medical mission and training mission in the Gulf Wars recently. And I believe that they're actually also deployed in other parts of the world as we speak. I think most notably the one against the Somalian pirates. We ring the bell, 6 important dates in through an official ceremony. We ring it on the New Year's Eve. We ring it on the Korean American Day, which is January 13th. And we rang it just yesterday. That's why my face is completely burned. It's Juneteenth, the Freedom Day. And we ring it again on the 4th of July for Independence Day. And the National Liberation Day, or Gwangbokjeol, on August 15th. And then Constitution Day on the weekend of September 17th. Those are the 6 official dates. And I will answer any questions about why these are so significant later. But the Korean American Day and Juneteenth were the bell ringing ceremonies we recently added. The Korean American Day about 10 years ago, when President Bush signed into law to recognize the centennial of the first Korean Americans arriving as a group to the island of Hawaii to replace the plantation workers and sugarcane farms in Hawaii. And you know how we talked about there's 7,000 out of 8,000 Korean Americans were living in Hawaii. That is the reason why. So the embedded culture and symbolism about the bell. The bell itself is a monument. It's an act of filial piety. But from a Buddhist and meditative purposes, they understood culturally there's an effect the sound and vibrations had in human physiology. And even if you couldn't read texts in Sanskrit or discuss high philosophy in intelligible ways, if you heard the bell and you felt calm, they felt that was enough. It's very much like those prayer wheels when you see in entrances to the Tibetan temples. People just turn those wheels and it makes the noise and vibrations. They don't necessarily have to know what's written on those wheels, but the physical act of touching and making it turn is considered an act of devotion. The bell is very much the same way. It's structured in such a way that it resonates in certain frequencies, and it actually has harmonic properties that create tertiary harmonics. And if you strike it correctly, it's meant to open up all of your energy centers So thereby giving you a sense of healing and restoration of energy. The symbolism around the bell, we talked about how it's changed on from the original divine bell of King Songdeok, whereas the other one would have been a little bit heavy on Buddhist symbolism. Everything was replaced with roses of Sharon, mugunghwa, which is the national flower of Korea. But mugung also means eternity or forever. And the four pairs of figures are holding, so one side is Goddess Liberty and holding hands with Korean angel Sunyo. And one is Taeguk, which is the symbol that's inside in the middle of the Korean national flag. Americans often know it as yin and yang, but it actually is a symbol for harmony and coexistence. And we talked about mugunghwa just now. That's the national flower, and that's the that means eternity or forever. One figure is holding a laurel, and that symbolizes victory. And then finally, the last figure is holding a dove. So four sets of figures, each of the Sunyo, or Korean angels, holding a different symbol. And if you read it correctly, you can actually create a sort of a poetry of sorts. So you can say peace, victory, harmony, forever, or any combination thereof. The structure itself has 12 columns to correspond with the 12 signs of zodiac, but each of these 12 signs of zodiac also has a corresponding directionality. And they are placed on top of a pagoda that has very steep steps that are narrow and tall, and in part because it forces the person who approaches it to walk it up sideways to be comfortable. And that is because to walk up to it straight and then turn your back against it is considered disrespectful. But by walking sideways, you're showing it some reverence. So there it is. She is holding a branch of roses of Sharon or mugunghwa, and these are the columns. So I really wish we could return to you coming to the bell because I don't think the looking at the photographs is really doing justice. But this is what I talked about earlier about a lattice structure from which the bell is hanging. These are meant to be the hexagonal representation of mugunghwa, the national flower, and it's adorned by two sets of dragons. So there's one here, but there are also golden dragons on the inside. So they're again meant to be a balance. Blue and gold are supposed to be complementary and supplementary at the same time. And the reason these lattices are there is that it corresponds to a blowhole on top. And so when you strike the bell, some of the frequencies would escape through the top and sort of get diffused by the structure. And this is sort of an aerial map of the Google. I think this was at the height of the drought when this photo was taken because I see no grass here. But the bell itself is structured in the middle. It's a square structure, but it's sitting on an octagonal base. And it's something that you can only see on an aerial photo. And so that actually ties in with a understanding of Korean numerology. So you have an octagonal base for a square structure, so 4 times 8, and it corresponds to different directions. And then you have to return to the center. So 4 times 8 is 32. Come back to the center for 33rd. And together that number represents universality or omnipresence. So each time you ring this bell, you're sending out a vibration of goodwill and harmony and healing and peace in all directions. So contained in it is an act of devotion and prayer to all who would listen. And so these people are actually being very smart by sitting out here because that's actually the optimal place to be able to hear it. So whereas the United States was given a giant statue, the Goddess Liberty, for the first centennial by the And Koreans are very much aware of that size and the scale of that gift. They didn't think that they could really try to top it or mimic it so close that they would have some giant statue here. However, by giving a musical instrument, they felt that they could probably have a further outreach. And also by giving an object that is considered sacred, but also extremely historical at the height of Korean culture during a unified period. So it contains many desires. They want the aspirations to reclaim their place in history, but they also have aspirations to be united again as one country. One of the interesting stories, and I bring this up as a MacArthur connection, is that initially when they were looking for a site to place this bell in the pavilion, they were discussing many locations throughout Los Angeles. And one of them was then ruled by a very powerful councilman named John Ferraro. And he wanted this bell to go on top of Griffith Park near the observatory. He said that would be perfect because then from there we could reach all directions to the end of the city from mountains to the beach. And they went up there and it was a magnificent sight. But it was actually the council president, John Gibson, who had some inside information as a council president that there was a plot of land that was being decommissioned by the Department of Interior and the Department of Defense. And this former site of Fort MacArthur would then be turned over to the city of LA for recreational use. So he brought the Korean representative to this site. And obviously, because it's the former battery for the artillery base, and they were designed for the defense of the port of Los Angeles, had a 270-degree panoramic view, but it was a little rough, and also it was so far from everything else. So they were a little bit concerned, yet their concern was assuaged but by the comment that this was actually named after Lieutenant General Arthur MacArthur, who happens to be the father of Marshal Douglas MacArthur, commander of the UN forces during the Korean War, as well as the commander of the armed forces, allied forces in the Pacific. So they said, well, perhaps this was meant to be. And we talked about earlier how this bell was an act of devotion by the son to the father. And that connection of bringing this bell as a beacon of thanks to the Korean War veterans. And, you know, obviously Douglas MacArthur would be a big part of that. And place it at the former base named after his father seems something of a fate and almost a destiny. I'm going to play a little video because the preservation committee that I work with since 2004 actually was able to carry out a full restoration in 2013.
The restoration of the Korean friendship bell is long overdue, if you ask local Korean Americans.
So happy. Good to see you again.
In 1976, the Republic of Korea presented the United States with an 18,000-kilogram bronze bell for its 200th birthday.
Many Korean American immigrants who come here often tell them that when they feel homesick, this is a place that they think of and they visit.
Ernest Lee, a member of the Korean Friendship Bell Committee, says this home away from home for many Koreans living in Los Angeles began to deteriorate after winter rains, exposure to salty ocean air, and improper maintenance. Korean Consul General Yan Sun-shin says the bell was in poor condition when he first saw it 3 years ago.
The bell was not in the shape, not just the shape, the bell was on the ground, disconnected, right? It was not properly cared at all.
Thanks to a sizable donation and artistic support from the Republic of Korea, the city of Los Angeles was able to restore the bell to its former glory. Korean bellmaster Chai Dong-hae and several South Korean artisans worked on the project for months.
My portion is only a very small portion. After today, the Korean Friendship Bell Committee will be responsible for its safety, each and every day.
And for Chai, hearing the bell ring during the rededication ceremony was personal.
It's very great to hear because my teacher created it 38 years ago, and now I am able to fix it. It makes me very happy.
This is the soul of Korean people, history of Korean people, heart of Korean people. Whatever issues you may talk about, patriotism, the respect for your parents, friendship, whatever, can be symbolized by and through the sound of the bell.
Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti made a personal commitment to ensure the Korean Friendship Bell never slips into disrepair again.
We put up some physical barriers to birds. We've made sure that there is the maintenance that we can have around. So I feel very confident that we will. I think that it is the very least that we can do to say thank you for the kind gift a second time from the Korean people.
The Korean Friendship Bell rings only 5 times a year, including America's Independence Day, July 4th, and August 15th, Korean Liberation Day. For producer Dion Moses, I'm Mike O'Sullivan in Los Angeles.
So that was actually almost 11 years ago, and time really passes. And I'm looking at my old video and realize how much older I have become. But here's actually a key matrix we need to talk about. And Professor Wu so capably demonstrated the wartime videos created by the U.S. Department of Defense of how devastated Korea was in 1950. So after the war, it was even worse. So not only were they exploited during the 35 years of colonial rule, we talk about 306,000 tons of bombs essentially blowing up every upstanding structure in the entire country. There was just nothing left. So in 1976, when the bell was given, not only was $500,000 to forge the bell, plus another $450,000 to construct the pavilion, a huge sum of money. I mean, adjusting for inflation, it would be about 33 million at the last calculation we just had. But also because given the scale of Korean economy at the time, in 1976, one of their goals was they wanted to have a per capita income of $1,000 per person. Today, in 2024, that figure is quickly approaching $30,000 per capita. It went from one of the poorest countries in the world, was, I think, ranking just below Cambodia in 1950s, and just trying to come up again in 1976, always lacking food because they weren't producing enough food in their country. Now, almost the 14th largest economy in the world. It dropped down a few notches, I think, post-COVID. It is still the 4th largest manufacturer and exporter of automobiles, one of the fastest internet in the world. I think number 2 exporter of smartphones and semiconductor chips. And 3rd largest trading partner to California. It's the only country, one of 5 countries in the world that has hosted both the Winter and Summer Olympics, as well as the Asian Games and the World Cup. And there are just many other things that are showing signs in Korea of remarkable growth. And just amazing future, and by all indication, if we can just somehow remove this specter of tension and military action anytime over the next decade or so. But you look at it from the same perspective of what was the difference between South Korea and North Korea. And the reason I asked that question earlier to Professor Wu was in 1950, when the Korean War occurred, Soviets had given North Koreans so much weapon, so many tanks and artillery, that the Americans were caught off guard. In fact, they were confident. The North Koreans were confident that within 4 months they would essentially push the Koreans out of the country, or receive a complete surrender. And it looked very likely, were it not been for some amazing acts of heroism and self-sacrifice of the many of the folks that defended the eastern border along the 38th parallel, that held back the North Korean troops from advancing to the south. Had they just gone ahead before the Americans could get their forces assembled, it is very likely they may have even lost Pusan. Then people would have to evacuate by boats. However, because of the delay that the North Korean forces were experiencing coming down south along the eastern border, caused the rest of the North Korean army to stand by. They were waiting for the other forces to join. And during that time, Marshal Douglas MacArthur was able to organize a dramatic landing in Incheon in September of 1951, cut off their supply line from the north, and essentially trapped the North Korean army in the south and separated any advancement from the north. And that turned the tide completely. And once they were able to remove much of the strength from the North Korean army that were already in the south, they were able to push them back all the way to Yalu River. And one of the miscalculations we're now talking about is the resolve of the Chinese army. Marshal Douglas MacArthur did not think that they had it in them to essentially arm 1 million people with barely anything above just a rifle, and very few even had ammunition for the rifle. In fact, some wartime photographs show that they were just boys, and barely covering their feet. They're wrapping their feet in cloth because their shoes were so inadequate. Yet there were so many. They're just, when you have 1 million people crossing the border during the nighttime and just ringing nothing but, gong, and just letting your presence be known, Americans had to evacuate. I mean, they talk about how they would find their machine guns would jam because it was firing so often and so much that the muzzles began to melt, glow red. And so we know about Chosun Reservoir and the retreat and everything that sort of turned into a stalemate for the next 2 years. But we hope that because this monument is actually a work that's not completed, we want to not only maintain it, but fully restore it to the original master plan. So we will complete the Walk of Remembrance. This is a new addition. So we will have a paved walkway along the perimeter of the Friendship Belt that will actually bear not only the 36,592 war dead during the Korean War, but we have had 70 years of continuous military presence. So anybody that served as peacekeepers will be able to honor their service in this Walk of Remembrance. We'll add
Mr. Lee?
interest. Yes.
I'm sorry, you have 3 minutes remaining.
Okay,
Just to
that's
let you
fine.
know.
Yeah, so we're almost done anyway. And then we'll continue to do educational programs such as this one. So question and answers. Should I go to the screen for?
Sure, thank you. It looks like there was a question
Sure.
and Carlos Garcia, but he said the question was answered through the video that was being shown.
Okay. What was the question? Perhaps I could add some more comments.
Okay, sure. Here in the chat, and Carlos, feel free to unmute and share if you want to add anything to your question. He asked, why was San Pedro chosen as a location for the bell instead of Koreatown or a place near Koreatown? Is it allowed to have it in the middle of the city?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Well, you have to think about it in terms of 1976. The Koreatown was not yet formed. I mean, it is one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in Los Angeles now. And in fact, I was part of a discussion group that was trying to redistrict the city council boundaries. And one of the arguments we were getting and pushback we were getting is that many of the Koreatown advocates were saying, well, the Koreatown, you can define it by west of Hoover and east of Crenshaw, south of Beverly, and north of Pico. And one of the city council members just slammed his desk and said, well, are you saying that all of LA is Koreatown? So, yeah, so it's a difficult line to draw. But in 1976, there was barely some business along the Korean business along the Olympic Boulevard next to some of the Japanese markets that were already in place. And so that was not one of the available sites. But I think it is significant. The mayor of Los Angeles wanted to treat this as a very significant gift, and that he wanted a location that will also symbolize that. So, I mean, we would need a giant park with the Bell Pavilion in the middle for it to accomplish the same thing that we're doing with the San Pedro location or the other proposed location of Griffith Park. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. The 1882, I left that hanging for you. Originally, the bell and the pavilion had no coloring. The Korean president, you heard about his name, Chun Do-hwan. He was sort of the military guy who came into power, a sort of a pseudo coup, and he ran for president on the promise, okay, I'm going to run for only one term, 1 5-year term, so elect me president. And so when he came to the U.S., he didn't know anything about the discussions of the committee or the consideration. He just looked at the bell and said, it looks a little bare. So the Korean officials jumped into the conclusion, okay, we need to please this president. And so what can we do? And they said, well, 1882, 1982, centennial of the diplomatic relationship between the two countries coming up, let's go ahead and adorn the bell with the traditional tanchang. Of course, it was an accident in retrospect, and happy accident, because we cannot imagine it being any other way today. It would have been a lot easier to maintain to keep it white, but I think it's the vibrant colors that becomes a true representation of Korean culture. So we're happy to do it, but here we are, almost 11 years after the full restoration. We're starting to raise funds to restore it again. It's like owning a home, right? You have to do the roof every 20 years. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for your time. I think that was the time limit, right?
Yes. Mr. Ernest Lee, thank you for your informative presentation about the Bell of Friendship. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to, if you have any follow-up questions, please forward it to Jeannie. I'd be happy to reach out to you with an answer.